And I'm the Deputy Director of the Jewish Museum here in New York and also curator for special programs of the New York Jewish Film Festival. It gives me an enormous pleasure to welcome Martha Rosler, Trevor Plagman, and Harold Fletcher here on the panel. Our discussion is part of a series that we organized for the New York Jewish Film Festival called War Against War, which also consists of a number of screenings that you see in the booklet, as well as an exhibition that you see on the other side of Lincoln Center in the Furman Gallery of posters of iconic anti-war movies. The title of the series, War Against War, originated with this particular book here by Ernst Friedrich, a German pacifist who put this book together in 1924, and it's become quite a classic in terms of anti-war literature, containing also a lot of images. And Ernst Friedrich also founded the first International Anti-War Museum in Berlin in 1924, which was then shut down 9 years later by the Nazis, and he was then sent off into a concentration camp. Most recently, we've seen the re-release of a movie by Stanley Kubrick, Fear and Desire, which he shot in 1953, which was his earliest film. And I thought it was interesting that a very key filmmaker of the 20th century, Stanley Kubrick, had such a fascination with the genre of the anti-war movie. Fear and Desire was his first one. Paths of Glory, and of course Dr. Strangelove, and then the last movie in that genre that he made was Full Metal Jacket. I then decided that I wanted to group a number of other movies around Kubrick's early feature. I Was 19, and Les Carabineers by Godard are going to be screened tonight. This afternoon we were playing Fires on the Plain by Kon Ishikawa, and on Wednesday we will see the Battle of Algiers. Obviously, given the amounts of war and conflicts that are going on right now, it's sort of very self-explanatory why we wanted to do this particular series. But one of the things I was interested in was how do filmmakers and artists respond to war, and I came across this quote by François Truffaut, who once said there's no such thing as an anti-war movie. And one couldn't really do an anti-war movie without at the same time also trivializing war, domesticating war, or in certain instances, of course, also glorifying war, which is something that we see, of course, happening in a lot of Hollywood movies these days. So I've invited 3 visual artists, and I should say that Ken Jones, who is the director of the New York Film Festival, seems to be stuck somewhere. He might still join, he might not, but I think we can do this, just the 4 of us. And perhaps I want to start with Martha, who has worked a lot around issues of warfare and feminism and coming out of the protest movement of the 1960s, anti-war movement, and during that period. And what is the title exactly of that beautiful piece that we talked about? House Beautiful. I only knew Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful. So I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and if there's any relationship between that and how filmmakers are addressing this particular issue of war.
I guess actually it's a series of montages. It wasn't a series then, but we deal in series now, so things that you make one after the other become a series. But that wasn't the intention. I think it's important to say. It also wasn't art. It was anti-war agitational imagery, also known as propaganda. It was not meant to be shown inside institutions, and it just was randomly published years afterward in the middle of our wars. So it's a series of photo montages drawn from Images of Life magazine, documentary images of war by people like Larry Burroughs and so on, inserted into American interiors or in relation to American interiors, particularly high-end suburban idealized ones, but also in the one that's actually itself called House Beautiful shows paintings and a Giacometti sculpture, the Walking Man, I guess that's what it's called. What its relation to what filmmakers were doing is an interesting question because, of course, it depends on montage and very particularly on, or if you prefer, collage, but I saw it as montage, which shows where the origins of my thinking lay, and very particularly a fairly rationalized three-dimensional space into which you could insert yourself, much as in traditional realist filmmaking. This was not what anti-war propaganda, that's not the form it usually took, and there were never any slogans or exhortations to stop war or whatever on the images. But it actually relates to TV because, as some of you may recall from experience or knowledge otherwise obtained, the war in Vietnam was called the first televised war because it was. I think I had a visceral response to turning on the TV at dinner time and seeing huts being burned. This seemed to me shocking and obscene and intolerable, that it was incorporated into the narrative of war and commercials and whatever else, sitcoms, whatever else came right along. So the context of production was a way to stop these actions to produce non-expressionist, non-Kata Kollwitz anti-war images by creating a kind of tableau vivant that collided, if you will, or interleaved ideas of the production of the American home and sensibility into and the image of the other that infiltrated in various ways as the bad example. I've often said things like, who has the right to live here and who has the right to lie dead outside the windows, or ici et ailleurs, as a way of just asking people to see without needing a lot of exhortation or explanation what is the subject here. And as I said, it was agitational. They were flyers. They were given out, black and white Xeroxes. They weren't intended for contemplation, but rather agitation.
What struck me when I saw these works for the very first time was that they really reminded me of John Hartfield's work in terms of a certain aggressivity and violence even that you brought into these images. And it's kind of interesting to connect perhaps that back, that you were looking at that type of material. I assume you were. I'm not sure if you did.
Another flashback to what U.S. culture was like in the mid-Cold War 60s. Hartfield actually wasn't published until the late 60s. The Frankfurt School wasn't published till the mid-60s, in translation I'm talking about. We didn't actually get to see people from behind the Iron Curtain, or people who were, which is where Hartfield was, or people who considered themselves communists or pro-socialist or whatever, somehow, people with bad ideas didn't get their work published. We all knew the early Hartfield associated with Dadaist sorts of things, but our understanding of who Hartfield was and what he represented was close to nil. However, I can't claim not to have been influenced because I can't remember. Absurdly enough, I would trace the direct influences to people like Max Ernst. Yeah. And even Otto Dix, did you say? Mm-hmm. Did he do paste things? He did?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe. But I didn't want to be a surrealist. I didn't want to be an expressionist. But I did find that what Max Ernst was doing was very potent. And Une Semaine de Bonté, for example, which actually also didn't get published, translated for a while.
With Otto Dix, I meant less the collage style, but more the imagery and the brutality of that.
Except no, I didn't want to brutalize the viewer. I've been a wuss about this forever. The question of can there ever be an anti-war film? I mean, I remember when RoboCop came out, people saying, at last, finally an anti-war film. I said, really? Looks like a superhero to me. Meaning that the multiplication of images of violence multiplies the reception of violence as something exciting and appealing, even if not consciously. So I don't go for images of atrocities. I did a whole video called A Simple Case for Torture or How to Sleep at Night, in which there is 1/2 second image of a tortured body that, and you're warned in advance, but really the torture is the torture of the information about the systemic relation between the US, forcing you to look at headlines, and several soundtracks about the relationship between the US and proxies engaging in torture. Now, mind you, this was from 1983, so this was from a time when we absolutely would never torture anybody, as opposed to now, when we're very happy to torture people, call it other things.
It seems that at certain moments artists have responded to war in a much stronger, more outward way than they're doing now. And when I was trying to think about, the panel and thinking about participants, it was really hard for me to think about artists who would directly address the subject of war or the irrationalities of war. Why do you think that is? Trevor?
I guess for me, the main war that I've been looking at and trying to see is this so-called war on terror, war, everything war, whatever you want to call it. And it's actually not the war in Iraq, although of course there's a relationship to it. And if the Vietnam War was the first televised war, maybe this war on terror was the first one since the advent of live television that was not televised, right, in any way at all, because it was mostly conducted in secret. We actually didn't even know where it was. I mean, it's all over the world. It's in computers, but it's also in shipping containers in rural Afghanistan, and it's in buildings in downtown New York City or what have you. And so in some ways, what's kind of been interesting about that is that project has just been trying to see this war, trying to understand what it looks like. And I never made this connection before, but I was thinking about it as you were speaking, how a lot of times the images that I end up using would be something like a sunset or a seascape, and then and there's literally sometimes there's the little tiny thing to see in the frame. Usually there's nothing to see in the frame at all, and the title will just say that, oh, here's this thing that actually would be in the frame if you could see it, which in some ways is that collapse of the familiar image with the image of war. But in many cases in the work I do, that image is actually absent. And I guess for me, these I think that's why the visual vocabulary that I end up using tends to be much more ambiguous and abstracted or kind of unclear or not so defined, is because actually what that war looks like is anybody's guess. Kind of on one hand, right? Of course there are things like the Abu Ghraib. Of course there are things coming out now like the torture report. But it is a very different kind of, visually, whatever that is different. But on the other hand, and we can come back to this question later if people want to talk about it, but I wonder in relation to filmmaking, to what extent there is a collapse of filmmaking with war making. And I mean that kind of very directly when we're talking about things like a reconnaissance satellite. That's a camera in orbit. What's a Predator drone? It's a remote-controlled camera that has some missiles attached to it, right? And so there is a kind of filmmaking that is war-making at the same time. And I'm not talking about, like war films that like creating heroic narratives to as a kind of ideological exercise, so much of the image-making as the operations of war-making itself. And we can come back to that later if you want to talk about it, but something I'm interested in a lot.
Well, it seems that there have been plenty of movies recently coming out, and some, glorifying war. Like we talked about Sniper and Lone Survivor, but there have been others that were also quite critical, or at least try to examine it from a different perspective. What's the name of that movie Catherine Bigelow made about the killing?
Oh, don't get me started.
Zero Dark 30, yeah.
That's not what it was called.
What's that? No, yeah, Zero Dark 30, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there has been enormous response, I think, by filmmakers towards the current conflicts, but so little by visual artists. You work with a lot of students, Harold. Is that something that you see perhaps brewing somewhere, but it just doesn't come to the surface among students?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I don't think I've actually encountered a student directly doing work related to war myself. And though I have done a project that was about war, a project that was called The American War, that was primarily or directly about the Vietnam War, but I think in some ways spoke to current conflicts that were going on in the Middle East as well.
But can you talk a little bit about the project, because I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I thought was interesting that Martha was mentioning was that Vietnam was the first televised war, but really, actually, no war was televised after that, because of the understanding, I think, of the government that there was such a response by the public to seeing that probably had a lot to do with the undoing of the Vietnam War. Why regular people were protesting it was because they had such direct viewership of what was going on there, and that's why there was a shutdown in the Iraq War on any kind of imagery coming in. So the imagery was much more limited. You couldn't see any body bags. You couldn't see caskets coming in. All of those things were restricted during the Iraq War, and during the first Gulf War there was footage, but it was like footage from airplanes. So you would just sort of see like the green lights of the targets, and people would watch it sort of like video games or something like that. But it was a really different experience than the kind of footage that was shown of the Vietnam War. The fact that they would have, the death toll running on the bottom of the screen and adding up on a daily basis. So that was like an interesting fluke, I think, that wasn't really ever allowed to happen again. And obviously, one of the results of it too was that war went underground. So CIA and covert action in the Middle East and in Central and South America, Africa, Asia, all over, that was sort of what was happening, but we weren't seeing any of it. And so when I did the project The American War, which was in 2005, well, one, just as a little anecdote, I recall right after 9/11, I was actually at an artist residency called the Headland Center for the Arts in the Bay Area, and everyone was sort of talking about what should we do? And I remember somebody asking me you do these sort of socially based projects, you must have an idea of what we should do. And I was like, I have no idea what to do. I'm not really prepared for this. This isn't what I don't feel like I know enough or know what the right response is, and I don't want to do something that is just sort of superficial, or I don't know, would just sort of fit into the art world and potentially be commodified and absorbed in that way. It didn't feel right to me. But then, interestingly, in 2005, I sort of stumbled on a project. And by then I was really feeling like I did want to address it, but I just didn't know how. And so I was doing a residency in Vietnam that I'd been invited to go to. And I was told by a number of people that I should visit this War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. And so I went there and thought it was really interesting to see the way that the Vietnamese government was representing the Vietnam War. And one of the first elements of that is that it's called the American War in Vietnam and not the Vietnam War. And that to me was a shocking sort of revelation. Not that they would call it that, but that I didn't know that already. And that somehow you could have that such a view that was so sort of focused on your own culture and never think about the opposite side of that. And so then the photographs that were depicted there, some of them I was familiar with, and a lot of them were actually from Life magazine and New York Times and things like that. But they were presented together in a way that was different than I'd seen them, and they had captions that were different. And I was really struck by it and was glad that I had the chance to see it and thought more people in the US should see it. And so my response after thinking about it for a while, talking to some Vietnamese artists about it, was in a way to use like an art historical response and thinking about Richard Prince and Sherry Levine and the idea of appropriation art, rephotographing existing images. I just went and rephotographed the museum, all of the images and all of the text, and then brought it to the United States and sort of recreated it and traveled it around the United States. So it was in Texas, and it was in Richmond, Virginia, and Boston, and here in New York, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco. But it was something that I sort of stumbled on, and then had to, I guess, respond to the opportunity that was presented to me, and the fact that I was interested in this. I just didn't know what to do, and finally something actually entered my life that allowed me to do it. And then for me, the thing that was really interesting was that I was able to use that project as a sort of educational tool for myself, so that it forced me to want to learn more about it. And I did lots of reading and watching films, and really trying to move beyond the Hollywood films and sort of watching documentaries, things that I didn't know existed prior to that. Although they're right there, I found most of them in public libraries. But then was able to also, as the exhibition was presented, I also did public events at each location where I would learn from people who'd had firsthand experience as vets or immigrants who had moved here after the war, or protesters, aid workers, nurses, doctors, all sorts of different things like that, historians. And so I had a sort of really in-depth and far-reaching education, personal education, while presenting this project to the public as well. But, and I've done a couple of other projects that have addressed war since then, partly because of my sort of involvement through that project, but none of my students have. They've addressed other things, but it's a hard topic to address, I think, and we're not really prepared for it. Art school doesn't prepare you to sort of deal with these kinds of issues, I guess.
There was an article recently in The Atlantic, I think, that talked a lot about comics and cartoons being made now as a sort of new form of engaging with that, which I hadn't, with war, a lot of cartoons, and that could be a possible way of engaging with it on a different level. So our relationship to war changes as our media sort of changes. Now you go online or you watch TV and you see images and films of war that people have taken with their cell phone cameras, or clips that they have shot with their cell phones, and it's even more immediate, I think, than perhaps what you were describing happened during the Vietnam War. So it's like, again, at a level where it can't really be controlled by the government, whoever controls that.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it's instead of it being presented on the CBS News, it's being presented through Facebook and and online platforms that didn't exist back then. And
do you think we have been like completely desensitized?
What's that?
That we have been desensitized?
I don't think so. No, I think you still, when you see those kinds of images, I personally, even after all of the looking that I had to do at those images for the American War Project, I'm still horrified when I even open my own book or something. It still affects me in a really visceral way. So I don't feel desensitized. I don't think people are.
But we don't see those sort of types of protests that we've seen in the past happening now to the degree, let's say.
Not because of image culture.
What are the reasons for it? And if you can maybe use a microphone.
Sorry. I would address the real world. It's the skin in the game problem.
Mm-hmm.
That, as you know, during there was a draft until Carter, I guess. There's no draft anymore. We have a mercenary army we have a caste, though that's a little strong because, in fact, it doesn't necessarily reproduce through generations. But, it's an employment scheme for marginalized, often rural, young people and various other marginalized groups. And the average savvy consumer is busy savvily consuming and doesn't have to worry about being drafted. And it's very unlikely that it's going to be your kid who's going. That's one argument, but that has a certain cynical edge to it.
Extremely, yeah.
Well, but if it's your ass on the line, it means something different. But I want to remind everyone that in the 60s, the largest cohort of people were under the age of 25. That was the baby boomer generation. So there was a gigantic unmoored group of young people, youth culture, don't trust anyone over 30, that was actively, in its cutting edge, actively rejecting forms and systems of organization and society that they had inherited from their parents. There is no longer a generation gap. That was the main feature of that generation. So, and one of the biggest impetuses for men to protest the war was not that they would be drafted, but that working class people would be drafted, whereas they, college students, had deferments, and it was a huge backlash against the idea of own privilege. So the picture is complex, but it doesn't come down to did we see or did we not see the images as the primary edge today and in the past.
But I think it's also important to point out that there was massive protests against the Iraq War all over the world before the war even started.
In 91.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think when we say like, oh, nobody's protesting, well, there was huge protests.
Yeah, but not a sustained protest. I did experience after 2002, which is when the protests primarily were, I guess, late 2001, that many of my students, people of goodwill, said, well, we protested and they went to war anyway. That is the idea of what a movement is, which we've only now rediscovered with Black Lives Matter. The idea that a movement is a sustained series of events and activities had been completely lost. Somehow they felt that if they went out, and millions around the world went out, that should tell the leaders that people didn't want this and it didn't work, and so they went back home.
When I mentioned the Catherine Bigelow movie, you were jumping up there. I'm just curious to hear why that was.
Oh, it's just that one, shooting ducks in a barrel. Basically, my beef with that movie is that I thought it was a film that was almost like a kind of postmodern kind of glorification of war kind of film, because it does something kind of interesting, where the whole film, the tone of it is almost like, oh, it's kind of somber, right? It's not like the dun-da-da-dun, dun-da-da-dun. It's not the cowboys going off into the sunset. But what the message of it basically ends up being is that, like, oh, it kind of sucks that we had to torture people and run this gigantic, clearly illegal, in unhuman campaign across the world in order to catch these unhuman people. Right, I mean that, and so it becomes a film that's very apologetic for this war on terror, for extra legal operations of that war and of torture and that sort of thing, in my opinion.
To me, it showed very well the irrationalities behind it and the sort of very strange dealings of meeting someone in Dubai and bribing him with a Ferrari to get the phone number of the assistant or of the brother of the assistant of, I mean, that kind of like detail actually then results in the execution or killing of Osama bin Laden was so shocking to me. I didn't really knew that before.
And you believe it. And you believe it.
I mean, it's so absurd that it's very believable.
But the torture report, with its full redactions, I think exposes, and actually she was already exposed, the woman who is being full of shit.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Alfreda Francis, I guess. I forget her name.
Yeah. Maya or Mia in the movie, I don't know. Anyway, but there's a lot of wishful thinking in that presentation.
Well, anyway, I wanted to get back to that question from earlier. Why do we see this amount of movies related to war, and why is there so few happening in other areas, so little happening in other fields of art?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, I mean, I think that we have to sort of like look at the system of art, and it's a commercial system about selling objects. And showing films is something that masses of people can go to or watch at home now, and it's not about purchasing something other than, you know, a $7 Netflix account for the month or something like that. And so it's much more immediately available to people. Whereas if the way that you're trained as an artist is to make an object that's going to be sold to someone, it's much harder to make a topical object. And then who's your audience for that? You know, and how many people are going to get to see it? So there's just not a system that's set up to allow people to respond in any sort of immediate fashion and get it out to a large number of people so that it has an effect.
That's such a crass idea, and I agree with it completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so basic to the state of art now that we need to some degree, acknowledge that this is in fact true. And also that students, to go to art school, take on huge amounts of debt as a gamble that they will have gallery representation when they leave, and that for a couple of decades now that has resulted in cautiousness to the point of abject cowardice, or a preemptive suppression of any ideas of producing images that are not saleable unless you are special, like Trevor, whose first exposure that I was aware of was through the New York Times with the logo.
Oh, right.
In other words, unless you have a very unusual way of getting into the system, it's not through your art school training and so on. This is not meant as an insult in any way.
No, I didn't mean that. I was pointing at you because I think you also have a history of dealing with some pretty hard-hitting stuff that's not necessarily...
I'm so old that I predate the period in which one might have expected to make a living from selling the work. And also, as I said, the first set of Bringing the War Home was I specifically refused to put it in an art context lest someone mistake it for an effort to speak to the comfortable and amuse them in some way or other. I mean,
where did you present those?
on the street.
So you
And
handed them out
I did, yes.
as Xeroxes?
Yes, exactly. Black and white Xeroxes. There were color Xerox.
Or in general?
Mostly at marches. It didn't occur to me to try to find people in any other situation. They did eventually get published in the early 70s, a few of them, in underground newspapers and magazines, but I didn't even strategize. I just was making them and handing them out, making them and handing them out.
Were other people doing the same thing? And what was
There were actually a few people doing images, mostly as silk screens and posters. And of course, there were text-heavy flyers. Flyers are a very common thing on all, all popular movements. But I wanted something that people could just look at. I very specifically didn't want to preach because I thought that the context was enough of a frame. But thanks for asking.
I apologize for
For
No,
what?
no, that's-
No, not at all. I don't.
So how did they actually eventually end up at the Museum of Modern Art?
Now, if it was music, I'd have to say practice. But, okay, so oddly enough, I stopped doing them when the war ended, which was effectively 73, even though it didn't officially end until 75. And I made a lot of other anti-war stuff too, whatever. But, and I was doing feminist material as well, but I went on to other things, more video, more photography. And at some point, when I moved back to New York from California in this is so unimportant, though. Actually, I would say, okay, so
I'm just more curious about what happened to the work.
Give 1 million lectures in art schools because I consider part of what an artist should do is to talk to students and other artists to say, and also the aim of these works was to say, this is easy, you can do it too, which is true of a lot of my work, which is to say, ain't no brilliance here, this is easy. So Benjamin Buchloh, I gave a talk at NASCAD, and Benjamin Buchloh was in the audience, and he was looking at some of these things, and this and that, various works, because always included in, here's what I've done, whatever. And he wrote an article on appropriation in art form, and he said, could I reproduce one of these? And I said, sure, and instantly, it was art, instantly. As soon, it was a full-page illustration, it was the one with Giacometti, it's art. And then someone wanted to show it in a nonprofit gallery, so I called up a friend, actually this is a little bit amusing, who was a curator. I said, people want to show these works, they're from the 60s, it's 1982 or whatever it was. And he said, be careful, there's a thing on now about reproducing work from the 70s and commodifying it. On the other hand, if you do it, people will see that this was done and that it can be done, and so that's an argument from history, and your name will be attached. So there was an argument from history and an argument from ego, and I thought, wow, what could be bad about this? So, but really the idea was, people shouldn't lose our history of the 60s, which has been so contested.
You wanted to say?
I just think it's interesting that would be the route that it would take, as opposed to, say, making it with the intention of it going into a museum.
I did. The next set.
Uh-huh.
But not in a museum.
A gallery.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. But I mean, maybe that work wouldn't have been made. It wouldn't have been made if you didn't have the impulse to make it originally, so that you could just hand it out as flyers.
I refused to sign them or date them as I was making them, so that I wouldn't be tempted to say, this is art.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's still a valid position now?
For whom?
Maybe we just open up to the audience and see if there's questions, comments. I don't know if we actually have do we have a microphone that we can pass around? No, okay, so you have to just be very loud. There, please.
I'm a Vietnam vet, and really glad to come today and to hear some people bringing back a lot of stuff I remember. But I do think, people have been pacified. There's a whole generation of people now have been pacified, and we don't live in a country, we live in an empire. This empire, everything from the people in Bangladesh who make our clothes, to all the wars, it's all supporting this empire. One of the ways they've actually beaten back and made people pacified is in the context of the veterans and the soldiers, these slogans of, thank you for your service, honor the warrior, not the war. All of that bullshit has allowed a whole section of people to think, to lower their sights, and to think that they cannot protest because you can't protest this GI. But the truth is, the GIs and the vets have actually gone out front in telling the truth. And instead of using that truth, whether it's the Iraq Veterans Against the War, I was one of the leaders of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I was one of the organizers of the Winter Soldier investigation. People can watch that film, which we premiered here at Lincoln Center.
Mm-hmm.
But, so all of this is part of that history. And I do, one is the question now that I think people are really grappling with, it's not just the anti-war question, it's the question that the whole earth is in peril. The waters are rising, and people are dying all over the planet. And the imagination that's needed is to actually imagine a different kind of society, a different kind of world that we want to live in, and how are we going to get there? And so, to me, that's what's really missing, is this massive debate in society over, how can we get past this madness and actually imagine a different world? And I don't mean a Garden of Eden, I mean a world full of contradiction and struggle, but it's not resolved through violence and exploitation and war and all that madness. And that's what's really missing, I think, in the society as a whole, but it's also not even amongst the artists. I mean, John Lennon's Imagine, you know what I mean? It's the only thing I can think of real quickly in terms of popular culture where people actually, you know, started to imagine that. And so my question, and the defining thing to me is that this phrase that people have to stop thinking like Americans and start thinking about humanity. And to me, that's the question I want to pose to people is what's your response to that?
Oh, thanks for your comment. And I mean, I think I'm glad that you cited Winter Soldier, because I think that that's a really incredible example of a film that that really, I think for the people that have seen it, it changes their view on it, and partly because it was made by vets, and that they're sort of talking about their own experience. And so that as an example, I think, is something that could be used as a model for all sorts of other situations and current events that you're discussing. But for anybody that hasn't seen that's you know, an incredible film to consider.
The question is a larger one that has to do with how do we project ourselves away from day-to-day life and its concerns to thinking globally and about the fact that we are in the midst of a very rapidly advancing environmental collapse, if I understand you correctly. It's really difficult to tell people who are struggling with the greatest financial collapse in the Western world since the Great Depression that they need to think about something more abstract in the day-to-day, and the entire political process is now, and economic processes are geared towards short-term thinking and short-term solutions to all kinds of things. There are, of course, many environmental movements. I'm sure you were at the anti-exploitation pro-environmental march in September 21st, I guess it was, and if not, that you're aware of it, in which people from all around the world came to support, and there, especially outside the U.S., there are many, especially in the endangered poorer nations, there are many movements trying to get environmental justice, I guess is what it is the term. It is extremely difficult to tell people in a consumer society that questions of consumerism and short-term things like educating their children or getting a job or whatever are they need to think about something in a more abstract way. I don't know. There are actually quite a few artists working on these issues. The problem is they tend to be less discussed, or they're a little bit abstract in the way they approach the question. It would be great to have corps of environmental activists who worked on imagery. We do have them, but they're, you know, it's problematic to tell a society that it can't care about the issues of daily life.
But I would also add to that like a way that society changes, I mean, part of it is by being able to imagine a different world, but that only goes so far. And I think I used to do a lot of anti-prison activism in California, and there was a point with that activism where we realized, hey, we actually don't have to convince people of this anymore. Like, we won. Like, and I think you could probably make that same claim with regards to like environmental destruction and climate change and that sort of like that part of convincing people is over. And the next question is then, well, how do you get your hands on levers of power to actually shift things around? And so we started doing a lot of work around like, how does the state budget work? Can we influence this senator to do this and that kind of thing? And there are artists doing things like that too. Like I think Laurie Joan Reynolds in Illinois would be a fantastic example of that as an artist who actually worked with former prisoners to shut down a supermax prison there, which is unbelievable. So I think that that's also another approach, that we don't just have to work in terms of, we don't just have to imagine that shaping ideology is the kind of end-all be-all of art making or cultural production or what have you.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, the lady.
I'd like to think that how I've been influenced to know about what's going on in terms of the war on terror, and also how my own thinking has been shaped by film. And what I came up with was that last Jeremy Scahill film that
The Dirty Wars.
The Dirty was so effective, but the question is how many people saw it. And it was more effective than anything else that I had read or heard or all of my news. And I've learned most of what I know about current affairs from documentaries on Democracy Now!, for example, but also from film. I mean, there's Jean Reno film, Cabinet, was very influential. And the Battle of Algiers was a different set of circumstances because I realized how much we had brought into the suicide bomber and how over the years I thought about that film and how my own view of it had changed. And it was even active at the time, because I had learned about torture from the discussions around the Algerian War and the literature. But that in the present time, it's been mostly through documentaries that I have gotten this kind of thing. And whether you call it an art form, it, you know, is, that wouldn't be the term that I would use, though it is. And I think the most effective thing, just about sheer information and perspective, and the idea of interviewing the people that Stengel interviewed, the collateral damage, was much better visualized there than anything else. You know, but when I tried to get people to go to see it, that was more problematical. One, because the showings were localized, but also, you know, getting a hold of the DVD and so on, how do you distribute it? But that, I think, was the most effective thing that came up. And I'd like to hear your responses to the other things of that sort.
Well, I was recently working on, spent a lot of time working on a documentary called Citizen 4, which was about Snowden. I ended up filming a small part of that. And I had never really hung out with documentary people before. I was friends with Laura Poitras and knew that, but kind of through the aftermath of that film, met a lot of people working in that medium. And I was really like, wow, there's really hardcore stuff that goes on in documentary filmmaking that you don't see that much of in the same way in visual art. And I think there's a lot of explanations for that. I mean, part of it is that a lot of documentary films are expected to lose lots and lots of money. And so it's funded through foundations. It's a very different economic structure that those come out of. So on one hand, it's like, what is funding it? And that kind of maybe opens up certain possibilities and forecloses others, in the same way that you talked about the economics of art making being different. So I think that's one hand. On the other hand, it's a very different form. I mean, if you're making a film, you can sit somebody down in the dark and make a narrative and develop an argument over an hour or two, if you want, that can really explain something, perhaps, right? In a way that I'm not sure visual art works that way. I think that visual art that has an argument or that tries to develop an idea that is outside of itself, it's tricky. I think that's really tricky to do. I think that visual art tends to be much more impressionistic, much more akin to developing a vocabulary rather than stringing that vocabulary together into an article or a series of arguments or what have you. So I think there's a limit of the media as well too.
Yeah, I agree, but I think also, in some ways, we've limited ourselves, even by calling it visual art. Then suddenly, I mean, if I think more of just myself as an artist or a contemporary artist that has access to any kind of medium or form or context, then you no longer have those limitations, because maybe you wind up making a film or a radio piece or an article or a book or flyers that you pass out or a performance. And I think that, so in some ways what's happened is that the system around art, once again, this sort of like commercial system, the art school system, has created a set of limitations that people just go along with for a variety of reasons. But that in and of itself, that structure, then limits what people feel like they can make or what they have. And I've felt the same feeling myself. Like I don't feel totally liberated, but I've seen the other side a little bit and realized that maybe to some extent, and Martha was sort of suggesting this too, that maybe there's some benefits to just not even calling yourself an artist at some points, because then you're more free than when you're limited to that concept of what that is.
I guess for me, I come from the opposite angle where, like, as somebody who has a background in other fields, like, it feels really important to me to insist on being an artist in order to say, no, I think that this is worth paying attention to in this particular way. And so I mean, I don't know, it goes both ways. But
Right.
Yeah, please.
Earlier, you referenced Francois Truffaut saying there's no such thing as an anti-war film. And I've been thinking about that in relation to how we are exposed to war, both in terms of documentary footage, but perhaps even more important, in terms of fictional work, such as Homeland. And in Homeland, we're seeing things which are supposed to be representative of what our government is doing in terms of using drones. And the thing that I find so frightening is how you can be sitting in a building thousands of miles away, and you push a button and you destroy people. This is creating a kind of a sociopathic society, if you will, because there are no consequences to you at the distance. And we have that in video games as well. So given that all of this thing, I believe, leads to a kind of personal desensitization of war, how do you as artists present something that isn't absorbed and used for the wrong reasons?
So for the first part of the question about this question of desensitization, I think that's always been a part of war. I mean, that has to be a part of war. You have to dehumanize somebody in order to be able to kill them, right? I mean, even in the Second World War and before, people talked about, oh, bombers are so terrible because you're just flying over the battlefield and you drop a bomb and you can't see them. But there is something I feel like at the same time, I feel like there is something new. There is something new in the idea that you're running what is legally, if not visually, a secret war of drones in Pakistan or Yemen or what have you. I think there is something new there. And so with this question of desensitization, though, I just think that that's always been a part of war. That's always been a part of how the thing works. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, to various degrees, and I know that something that I've read was that over time they've somehow been able to calculate how many soldiers were like shooting over the heads of the people they were supposed to be, and that the military has found ways to get them to shoot people at a higher percentage of actually shooting people, and so they're doing something to be able to get the military to sort of lose that sense of empathy that we were discussing before about the German and French soldiers coming together in World War II and celebrating Christmas and playing soccer or something like that. I mean, the more that you feel a lack of empathy, then the easier it is to kill someone. And I think that, all of these things that you're discussing, bombers and drones and all of those things can contribute to that. And the thing that I guess we can do as artists or as anybody really is to try to create a greater sense of empathy, because I think the more that you have a personal connection to a place, the less you want to kill those people, or the less acceptable that becomes to you. So if you've visited Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or any place and know people in those places, then when you hear about deaths in that spot, you're much more alarmed and uncomfortable about it because you have a personal connection. And that just seems to be how humans work. And that there is a role that media, film, or any other can play in creating sort of a sense of empathy too. So I think that's one function that artists can take is in documentaries or radio or literature, journalism, or anything like that can attempt to create greater empathy.
I think it's at the risk of being obfuscatory. I think it's much more complicated. People have been killing people for a few millennia, and it's not because they were desensitized. It's because the definition of us and them, or who's human and who's not, has been powerfully implanted in people. That's what the socialization process does. The problem is that in particularly a post-colonial world, if you will, the extension of subjectivity to all peoples impedes the ability to tell people go forth and kill. So there have to be all this narrativization that says, well, you know, those people are worse than any people who've ever lived, like ISIL, you know, Daesh, whatever you want to call them. You know, I remember, I forget his name, in saying, oh yeah, well, maybe Nicaragua wasn't so bad, but those Salvadoran guys, they are worse than anybody who's ever lived, and they're the real evil guys. Alexander Haig. The problem with Homeland, et cetera, which I can't watch it, they turn my stomach, so I'm making it up. I keep turning it off. I mean, I couldn't watch 24, can't watch that stuff, is, of course, they're all false narratives. And one of the interesting things is something that you reproduced, which we all think at first, which is that being a drone operator in a containerized control room in Colorado keeps you from any relationship or affect from killing people. In fact, it turns out it's quite the opposite, that the people who do the drone warfare get PTSD because they spend weeks to months actually surveilling these humans whom they see at very close detail. They get to know them and then they kill them, which is very different from, say, B-52 high-altitude bombing. So I think actually there was a reason why they wanted to give these guys, you know, medals of honor, which had to be withdrawn and given surreptitious thing, because in fact, it is not yet perfected. What we need is robots to do it, and then we won't have to worry about empathy. And of course, battlefield robots are the next issue, but, you know, remember, it's the society that creates those weapons of warfare, not vice versa. It's not that the drones or aerial bombing have made us worse people. It's that we have made those technologies of war. So it comes down to a question of social organization, training, attitude, and so on, which I think it's really important to remember. The technology doesn't make us, we make the technology.
Absolutely, and I think that is when if we're looking towards something that is new with this thing like drone warfare, that's what I think it is that the idea of the signature strike. And when that term came out, the signature strike, I always thought that meant, oh, the president has to sign his signature to kill somebody. But then it's a metadata signature. It's like, if you have this cell phone and you're in the vicinity of this wireless network and you look like you're this age, that signature qualifies you to be killed, regardless of whether somebody knows who you are or not.
I wish we had images of all of your work. I wasn't familiar with it. Can't hear you. I wish we had images of all of your work, although I'm familiar with it. And Trevor, like, your work is very beautiful and sublime. And I wonder if it all is, and if it kind of works in the art world with collectors because of that beauty and that sublime. And it made me think about artists from other parts of the world, from the Middle East, from Iraq, places that are war-torn. If collectors are tending to, and it's what you said and what you agreed with is just so upsetting that as artists we've come to a place where we have to think about our economics, and it's everything that art has never been, so it's kind of heart-wrenching. But putting that aside, I was just wondering if the world of collectors, people that have money that are buying work, or tending to buy work from these other artists in other
Can I jump in for a second? Art is a globalized commodity. It's like real estate. You don't have to be there to own it. And I'm quite serious. It's one of the places where you put your money. And therefore, it's not the local artists who get supported in any meaningful way, and particularly not the ones who are talking about unpleasant things, but rather there's an A-list that covers the world, which is very disturbing. It's part of what the International Art Fair and before that the biennials have been promulgating, which is this internationalized A-list and B-list. And no artist I know of, except possibly one or two who actually don't live in the countries they're from, make work that's considered worth paying attention to in the sense of buying it and so putting it in museums and so on. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't really know about who's being collected from different places around the world, but I do want to take issue with this idea that, the art world is all about commodities and big galleries. That feels very New York centric to me. I mean, when I was growing up on the West Coast, like, we had no idea about galleries in New York and this and that. I mean, there's this whole other system of academia, of people making art and working in art schools and teaching that is not, it has its own different kind of economy. There is, and in particular when we're looking overseas as well, we're looking in different places in Europe, there's many different artists doing lots of different kinds of work that don't have anything to do with galleries and art fairs and that sort of thing. A lot.
First of all, I taught for 35 years. I will say the system of who gets hired, who gets retained has changed dramatically. The debt structure really affects people. Europe is very different because still students don't pay for their higher education, including in art school in most countries. It's true that artists tend, and artist professors tend, to be reliably on the left, if you will allow me to put it that way, and to be in favor of agitational work, if I can say that. But the fact is that we are ruled by the commodity in ways that didn't exist when I lived in Southern and Northern California for 12 years, where we never thought for a second about the gallery system. I think that this is a relatively recent undercapitalized asset class that, well, I'm actually serious about this, and that the discipline imposed on those who work within the system is much more stringent than it used to be, which doesn't mean that there aren't tens of thousands of artists who do work that you and I would support.
Yeah, but I think going back to what Harold was saying, and you as well, it is indeed true, I think, that there is art made that addresses very specific conflicts, not war on a sort of like general level, but very specific. Last year at the Venice Biennial, I remember in the Palestinian Pavilion, the Akram Zaatari film, for example. And Akram has become quite successful with his work, but it is still very, very difficult. I mean, Walid Raad is another example, or think about all the Atlas group work that he did previously. Yeah, he lives here. So there is definitely a possibility, I think, and it even works in the market, because for better or worse, on the one hand you can say, yeah, these things are nice looking because a collector might respond to them because of that, but once they're inside the system, they reveal a sort of more subversive message, and the other way around as well.
I have to pull out an old Frankfurt School concept of repressive desublimation. They're allowed a certain amount of negativity within the system, which is otherwise, I hate this concept, but it's unfortunately quite functional, that there's always going to be a representative of the countervailing position, which is a way of damping down the output. So,
I mean,
all
Harold's
that
piece
said,
about the Vietnam War, the American War, found its home in a collector.
Wow.
Right. I mean, once again, from a similar situation as you, without that being the intention, and so it's interesting that happens too. And I think in some ways maybe that it's for my experience, Trevor, is that, yeah, and the places where there isn't an art market, historically there has been different kinds of work that have been produced, and oftentimes those things did get co-opted by a marketplace later or something, performance or land art or assemblage or whatever. But now what I see is just traveling around, like visiting MFA programs in wherever, Kansas or Iowa, they're all like using the New York model as if they're going to sell or have a solo show at a Chelsea gallery after they're done with their MFA program. And there's very little deviation from that. So it's somehow like being modeled, even though there isn't any real function to it for the most part, which is, I think, to me, I don't know whether it's like intentional or not, but it winds up having the effect that it dampens down the production of these artists, these sort of like supposedly radical thinker people, and they're all sort of being, directed towards this one output that is actually totally contained and safe, and instead of like doing more things that would have some kind of direct effect. That said, also, I think there are many artists who work within the normal art world who I totally respect and think have done amazing work, and so I'm not trying to be critical of that. I'm just critical of the larger system and the effect that's had.
Maybe the lady up there.
This may be less of a question than I guess something to ponder, but as somebody that has been involved in the acquisition of work, both on behalf of collectors but also of major institutions, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is when artists' work enters the market that comes from a place we wouldn't traditionally consider to be a market center, that we might want to think about inspecting that artist's personal network and professional network and access to wealth outside of what we consider to be a traditional wealth center. So in the case of a number of artists that I know that have recently been acquired by some major institutions, they've been lauded as, well, like coming from outside of the traditional art market or coming from a region of the world that doesn't have access to great amounts of wealth. But in fact, those artists belong to some of the wealthiest families in those countries, and those families' international business connections provided them with the entree into the art market. So yes, there is work that is being produced outside of this very New York-centric model. But when we look at who then gets into the New York-centric model, I think we need to, stop and ask ourselves, how did this happen? Maybe there's a more, not to be too much of a neo-Marxist, but a sinister capitalist history here. And I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that this type of Athena springing from the head of Zeus model of like, oh, this person got here on merit doesn't really happen that often in the art market right now. Sure. And I think that actually extends into the way that film is distributed as well. Oh. I mean, Catherine Bigelow actually has major connections to programs like the Whitney Independent Study Program and Larry Weiner. And she got a start in the movie industry because of those connections.
Maybe. I don't know too many people from the Whitney program who've managed to parlay their, or art and language, which is even more absurd that she was. But I want to say, sociologically speaking, I wasn't aware of or hadn't thought about, these are the scions of the wealthy families, because that's who could afford to, the first child takes over the business, second child goes into the military, third child is an artist. I mean, this is something, but
not very different here in the U.S. either.
Which
artist is truly working class?
Well, of course, there used to be many.
Yeah, but these days,
right.
You talked about the
that's
financial difficulties
that's what
that
I plan on
involved.
talking about in the Dead Fair conference. But sociologically speaking, the way an artist from the periphery, it's ironic that there is still metropolis and periphery when, in fact, the system's globalized. But if you're from the periphery, the way you get known is by living in London or New York or some other center and coming to the attention of curators or whatever, and then moving back and saying, look, I'm now authentically reinserted, or not, but still represent that country. So I just want to say that all this negativity doesn't mean that any of us believe that this system is totalized or not porous. I happen to believe very strongly in the revolutionary potential of art, because what it does, of course, is create an unruly space for thinking about things that are not normally considered in ways that are not normally seen or heard. I just want to pledge my allegiance
I think that the
to
negativity
art.
is also an expression of a certain conflict or disorientation that has something to do with what Trevor was saying. We don't only have one art world anymore. We have several. And you mentioned an art world that is maybe more socially or politically engaged, or something that is more academic, and something that's completely oriented towards the market. And you see how extreme the market has gotten, and how less and less people like us feel having a relationship with that. And that's, to me, is just a sign of how this whole art world, how we knew it from the 20th century, is changing. And within that, also the figure of the artist completely changing towards this commodity production and sort of conceptual decoration on the one hand, and then still continuing to be, as you say, having a revolutionary spirit and criticality.
Which puts us into the realm of people like Marina Abramović, who are being recreated as kind of a post-shamanic shaman, performance artist who is, it's essentialized that this is what art represents, which is a kind of, theatricalized celebrity, a concentration of all kinds of celebrity characteristics that then are, which then is about, on the one hand, modeling lack of empathy, and then a kind of a granting of empathic relation to individual viewers. So this is, to step aside from the commodity world, it's another version of the artist as the seer, which in itself is highly commodified. But it is an effort to move away from the idea that what artists do is they make things you want to buy. Rather, the artist is recreated, kind of like Warhol did, as a figure who imparts some magic through the direct gaze or whatever. Just
there's a question in the very back.
What is the role, if any, of the critic in generating discussion of these works, attention to them, to in the broader context of the information and the thinking that they may be generating or hopefully generating? Is there really a role, or is it kind of meaningless?
I think that the potential is there, and that voice can add sort of a legitimacy to doing work that steps into these realms. I know that, once again, just sort of referencing this project that I have experienced with the American War, it showed at a few places in Texas and in Virginia, and had some local effect, I guess, or impact. But when it came here, it was written about in the New York Times and other art forum and things like that, and suddenly it became legitimized in a way that it wasn't before, and attention and interest in collections and all of those things that wouldn't have happened, I think, had that not been. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's like good and bad aspects to that, but it shows that it has a lot of power, and so the critics have the opportunity to present that. I mean, I think things are changing with new media, web-related stuff, and there's a legitimacy to that stuff that didn't happen in the past. So maybe that is changing, but I think still there is a power to certain journals and certain venues that way.
I mean, the sad part of all of it is that there is more and more outlets that need more and more material in order to fill the pages, whether those are web pages or the pages of an actual magazine. And very few people actually ever really get to read the full content. And you get a text message and it says, "Oh, I saw this thing on your show in this and this website." But does anybody actually really read these things? It's a big question to me.
Does anybody actually write these things? I'm very worried about the critical establishment.
Exactly. Who
And-
writes it?
Well, unfortunately, I know a lot of writers. They're all young and get paid nothing. And also because we've converted from a longitudinal and formalistic relation to art to what we call the contemporary, which sort of has erased all relations to previous trends in art, if you will. They don't have to know anything, and they're scrambling to write and write and write. And a lot of what they do is heroic, and there are a few figures who are extremely intelligent, but as you say, in a sense, this is a little bit of a throwaway. But I think this is a transitional moment, because just like the journal N+1 has been around for a while, and then its readers are now kind of in every publication, its writers, sorry, are in every publication. I think that the people who are kind of freelance, low-paid or no-paid writers actually are people who aren't in liege to the forces that would say, but you have to write about this in such a way that our readers aren't going to freak out, our collectors aren't going to freak out. So I think it's not a great moment right now, but I do have a lot of hope that after the shakeout of magazines and so on, that more critics will emerge.
Yeah, maybe, gentlemen.
I spoke before, and I guess I have to make an apology and also be blunt. I apologize, and this one back here is the only one that used the word capitalism. I think I apologize for not naming the system we live under, which is capitalism imperialism. And to be blunt, every day that 1,100 women have to die in Bangladesh to make our clothes, or the people in Guatemala have to die so that we can get 59 cents a pound of bananas, is another day of suffering, and it's intolerable. And I think this conversation where we kind of go around and discuss how we're going to work our way through it and reform it, and get, there's another day of suffering all over this planet. We're 5% of the Earth's population. We consume 50% of all the natural resources on the Earth. That time is running out, and it has to. And the people, I think, have to take responsibility for changing it. I think we need socialism. There is a plan for, it's called here the Constitution for a New Socialist Republic in North America. There is a plan for this. But I do think that's where the conversation has to go, and not how we're going to work our way through this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
No, I'm not sorry.
There's something very incredibly irrational at the heart of the of humanity, and I think war is probably the most violent expression of that irrationality. But it goes into all these areas. We of course know that there's climate change, there's enormous poverty, and none of this would have to happen if we would just shift gears a little bit. But we don't, and the question is, will we ever?
Well, to pick up on that without getting deep in the weeds, one does need to point out that the absolute baseline presumption of capitalism is that it must expand, and that the capacity for further expansion is destroying the planet.
And that is logical within that system. It's actually not irrational.
Well, good. I hope some of you can join us for the screening of Carabinieris, which is at 6:15 over in the Walter Reed Theater. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our panelists. Sorry? Yeah.